Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. This is Live with Search Engine Land. I am Search Engine Land editor George Nguyen, and here with me is Matt Dorville. I'm like 99% sure that last name is correct. And
Nope, you got it. You're good.
Yes. All right. Always got to double check. And you work over at BuzzFeed. You're an SEO manager. Is that correct?
Yes, I'm actually the head of SEO for BuzzFeed, BuzzFeed News, and for Tasty.
Right. Awesome. It's so great to be in touch because BuzzFeed is a major organization and has a great interest in what we're going to be talking about today. But I'm going to kind of wind it back a little bit to give everybody that frame of reference that they need to kind of participate in the conversation. And for our live attendees to ask questions, please do so in the chat box, and I'll go through them and I'll read them during our discussion. Hopefully Matt will have an answer. And if he doesn't, then, you know what, we're just going to throw darts at it. We're just going to have some fun today, right? Everybody can use a little bit of fun. Yeah. Okay. So the AMP announcement, which wasn't really the AMP announcement. 3 weeks ago, Google introduced the page experience update. Now that was kind of their overall announcement, which essentially bundles together the existing search ranking factors, the mobile friendly update, page speed update, HTTPS ranking boost, the intrusive interstitials penalty, safe browsing penalty, and its new core web vitals. That's all kind of bundled together as the page experience update. And if you watched our last Live with Search Engine Land, in which my colleague Barry hosted, Mike King and Marty Weintraub kind of lumped that together. They said it wasn't really an update. They said it was a rebranding of sorts. What they all agreed on was that the real news is that when the page experience update rolls out, which is sometime in 2021, Google will tell you when. They haven't announced an official date. Google will also remove the AMP requirement for content to appear in the top stories carousel on mobile results. Up until now, that has been a requirement for news publishers just to get there. And that prime visibility, I understand, means a lot. Yes, so in its place, they're incorporating these page experience factors instead of that AMP requirement, which is why the announcement was made together. Some people said, you know, it's buried in the announcement somewhere. It was like in the third paragraph, you know. In today's Live with Search Engine Land, we're going to discuss the not so distant future in which publishers have to decide what they're going to do. And we'll also explore more distant scenarios regarding AMP's overall survival and what that will look like. Okay, cool. And also, I almost forgot to mention, quick plug, and I'm going to do it again later. Live with, not Live with Search Engine Land, but SMX Next, our virtual conference is next week, June 23rd through 24th, just 2 days. And it's totally free. We've got speakers from Microsoft, Moz, Macy's, other companies that start with M. Just kidding. Condé Nast, so on and so forth. But I'll tell you more about that later. It's absolutely free, and I hope you sign up. Okay, Matt, before we get started, thank you for bearing with me. You want to tell us a little bit about yourself, a fun fact?
Sure. Let's see. I did this fun fact at BuzzFeed recently, too, because I just did a training. You know, I've got a baking blog, and I've been doing a lot of baking now, like everybody else in quarantine. So if you want to sign up to my baking blog, it's Made by Matt BK. I do a lot of really cool cakes. Did a really good Nightmare Before Christmas cake. You know, now I think it's also Baking for a Purpose weekend or Bakers for a Purpose or something. It's a big baking weekend, so it's time to go and yeah, bake a little bit this quarantine. So if you want to sign up for that, that's great. Yeah. Oh, George, you're muted.
I knew that was going to happen.
That's okay. Well, you got a fancy microphone, man.
That makes up for everything. I'm looking forward to this baking blog because I'm having trouble with my leaven. All right, cool. We got that out of the way. Let's get to what we're really here for, though I do love me some good bread. So just for context here, this doesn't mean anything. This news doesn't mean anything if you don't know how important that top stories carousel really is. How big is it a deal to get your content into that top stories carousel? If you can just, I know you can't just be like, oh yeah, it constitutes 5 million more views or something like that. But if you could just give us a sense of scale here for content that gets there and content that just kind of ranks organically.
Sure. For BuzzFeed, it matters. It matters quite significantly, but not as much as it does for BuzzFeed News, to be honest. BuzzFeed News does a really good job of getting very good ranking with their investigative reporting. So what happens is that they will go and try to break something, and that usually does very well for Google News. BuzzFeed tends to be a little bit more reactive. They'll see something going on and want to provide a more first-person story to the issue, and that sometimes gets ranked very highly, especially because BuzzFeed does a really good job at link acquisition. So, people tend to know about BuzzFeed more from a social standpoint of it, and we do get a good amount of links from that. We show up but what we have seen is that there is a good amount of correlation between top stories and Google Discover, which has been a really good driver for us as well. So it is really important, and we do train our writers on ways and guidelines that we think we could get into Google News a lot better. But, for BuzzFeed News, we find it more of this environment has done much, much better for BuzzFeed News because there's been so great of opportunities for investigative reporting.
Yes, I spoke to John Shihada over at Condé Nast, and he just, without going into any specific terms, he just said it's a world of difference in terms of the traffic provides. So that gives you some clue for those of you who actually don't work with publishers, or maybe that just work with publishers but are at an agency. It's a big, big deal. Let's briefly discuss the page experience update. Do you have any particularly strong feelings about it? Is it non-news like some people are saying? How do you feel about it?
I kind of agree with the previous panelists that say it's a little bit about marketing more than anything else. Most of these were already tracked, and what we did is we've always put these metrics at like a high level at BuzzFeed, but the issue is that we just really wanted to make sure to test everything when the big change happens. So even though that these are business priorities for us, everything that's listed out in this report, I think that honestly it's a little bit of a PR thing where Google is just showing different ways in which they could try to get your company to conform to what they want. And a lot of the stuff is just stuff that they've said before, and it's just more of pushing the same thing. So it is kind of put up in a nice little pretty package, and it's great, but everybody should have already been working on that a long time ago, honestly.
I agree. It's extremely important in this day and age. I know people aren't exactly on their mobile phones as much, or in the same sense, you're at home, you might be just reading news on your desktop. So that kind of skews things a little bit, but I think hopefully eventually we'll all be out in a place where we can be mobile again, and that's going to be extremely important. Are there any signals that you would add to it, or you feel like it's pretty comprehensive? We listed a bunch of things there.
I mean, there's always things that you want that Google doesn't give you, but that you'd like. I mean, there's a variety of things on Bing Webmaster Tools that you could say, God, if I could just get GSC to give me that, that would be amazing, especially that new backlinks report would be incredible on Google Search Console. But, I think that, again, they're unveiling certain things with a little bit of a hidden agenda. They want people to do certain things that make it better for Google. So so even though some of the things that we want, we have to see, well, what does Google want and all of that. And if you're asking pie in the sky, anything I can ask for, I mean, yeah, again, that new backlink checker from Bing Webmaster Tools is pretty damn good.
I can't tell you how many times I've heard something like that about at a conference or just over here where somebody says, yes, this great new thing, or it's experimental from Bing or from Microsoft is awesome, but I don't have the volume to really make use of it. But anyway, we're getting off topic a little bit there. As a publisher, then you're going to come up to this point, this decision-making point, where at some point in 2021, we don't know when, stay on AMP or gradually move off of it, or maybe there might be a scenario in which you're like, all right, we're totally abandoning it. What are your top considerations for staying on AMP? Or let's start with staying on AMP, and then I get the same kind of question is like moving away from it, but what would get you to stay on it?
It honestly is about the amount of backlog that our engineers have, because there's a lot of websites out there that their mobile site is just as fast as AMP, or if not faster. And right now, currently, speed has been put up to a high factor for BuzzFeed, but this seems like if we're going to move to a off AMP, we're going to want to have that as a higher factor. Because the great thing about AMP is it does provide like a really good experience for people going and browsing, seeing, like reading a quick article and then going to something else. So what we're going to want to do is really match that. If we decide to keep with AMP, it's going to be a lot of testing to see essentially when top stories becomes available to publishers that don't have AMP, we're wondering where they're ranking. We're wondering how many times AMP shows in top stories versus ones that aren't. We're wondering also if the visibility of certain publishers that go off AMP change in a monthly time frame. You know, doing AMP it takes a lot of work because you're essentially doing another site. So it's a little bit difficult to really decide upon that. But the way that Google really puts that carrot in front of you is offering traffic. And I think that there's going to be a lot of testing in the future. But I see a lot of publishers going off of it, and I see that we could think about going off of it if we could open up the bandwidth. The tough thing, though, is this just happens at a time where, you know, a lot of companies are furloughing a lot of people, and where we've been saying that the amount of people that are really good quality talent are having a hard time finding jobs because they've been furloughed out of their position or they've been laid off. So it's been a really, really tough time to say, hey, you know, we're going to put a priority on certain things like tickets for our site that will help speed, that will help things in the page experience. But at the same time, we have less engineers, we have less bandwidth, we have less people on staff to go and do that. So it's a little bit difficult of a time, and hopefully the economic environment will change so that we can make pivots for them.
You touched upon a lot there, a lot of push and pull factors, and I see that we're already getting a question in there. Thank you for that. We will get to that at the end, hopefully, if there's time. You talked about a lot of things and that inertia within the company, or also being low on bandwidth, we'll discuss also. One of the considerations that you mentioned to me for the article, the companion article that we've already published to this, and we're probably likely going to publish more coverage on this, this very discussion, is the aspect of ad revenue. Publishers need to make money, and ad revenue is an extremely common way to do that. How does staying on AMP restrict this for you presently?
So the difficulty with AMP is that it's difficult to go and supply the same kind of personalization with ads that you would off AMP. So we do rely upon ad revenue for BuzzFeed. We have had moments where the BuzzFeed homepage has like autoplay a video to go and promote certain like sponsored takeovers, and that shows up on individual articles as well. So this ad revenue is incredibly important to us, especially during an economic time where you know, we see a recession coming about. So it's a really difficult thing for us. Now with AMP, what you have is a lot of times you go and you give the default ad because you don't have the same kind of impressions you don't have the same kind of information about the users coming to the site as you would if they just went to the desktop or to like your mobile site. And in that, you tend to lose a little bit more money than if you could supply them like a more expensive ad. And that needs to be weighed with the amount of traffic you're expecting to get. Now, if you're not in top news at all, then what's going to happen is that the drop-off is going to be rather spectacular. If you decrease just a little bit the amount of increase from the revenue that you're going to be getting from your mobile ad versus the AMP ad, might be enough to make you kind of sway in one direction. Also, there's like the conversation that comes into be about apps on your phone. So BuzzFeed has an app, Tasty has an app. We have to monitor, is it more beneficial to send our user over there than it is to send them to the AMP page as well, because AMP does trump the app as well.
Wow, lots of considerations. What about, so if you didn't have if you had if you had AMP removed, right, and you were able to implement ads the way you wanted to bring in the most revenue, there are compromises there in terms of site speed, aren't there? And that feeds into the user experience.
I mean, yeah, there can be. I mean, lots of ad tracking comes in forms of JavaScript that AMP wasn't allowing. So it makes it rather difficult to go and get that tracking on people that you'd like to get the best type of ad for them. Yeah, so again, it's more of whenever you have a business, you have to weigh these pros and cons of what it takes to run that business versus you don't want to alienate, of course, your usership. So yeah, it's a lot to think about, because a lot of times when you look at the speed of a page and how much ads go and just add to that speed, it's rather large at times. And now these things also, this has been talked about from John Muller's team, where they said that that's reflected in the usership. The user doesn't really care about all that. And the ads could be changed in a way so it is faster. But again, this is just more bandwidth for your engineering crew. I mean, the amount of stuff that they already have to do is going to be rather high. So to add on stuff on top of that, it really kind of delays new features that you want to do that maybe come to be with more information about your usership. Google doing this kind of blanket way to convince people to go on AMP might delay some beneficial things that Google doesn't know about for our specific users.
So we were talking about your baking blog. I want to bring it back to that. Let's talk
Sure.
about layers here, like a cake, because there are a lot of considerations that you just put out there for our listeners. And of course, BuzzFeed is huge. So we're talking about the implications for a major publisher like yours. Let's recap some of these considerations again. So first of all, testing to see what kind of performance you can achieve. That was one of them, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then you mentioned the bandwidth of your developers.
Yeah, so if we're going to go and create a faster site to go, and one of the things that we've already done was, like, when you create an AMP page, it's not necessarily more tough, but at the same time, it's setting aside certain developers to work on something that you're kind of being forced to do. If you're changing around that and say we're going to create our site just as fast, then we have to set up time for them to go do that, and we already have a pretty full list of things to do.
Right. I think everybody can understand that, regardless of what organization they're in at this point in time. So there we have competitors, and then we also have your own ad team or your own development team, and then we have advertising the way you want to and how that impacts the user experience. Those are the three layers I'm seeing so far. Have I missed anything?
No, you're right. Advertising the way you want to possibly create more revenue too. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Lots of pieces to juggle there in your decision to either stay on or get off of AMP. And it's really, I feel like it's just going to be extremely difficult to tell from just outside perspective, and also how the change occurs when it eventually does occur. I imagine the people that are on this call, they may not work directly like with develop or as like implementing the AMP. And if they do, then they know how much time that takes up, so they might have a better idea. Let's talk about that though. Some companies, they start rolling the ball, and then once it builds up that momentum or the inertia, conversely, it's really hard to stop that. So for publishers that are already up and running on AMP, I think the decision point will be when the site goes through any major overhaul, said Matthew Brown, former, I forgot what his title was, but he used to work for the New York Times. And he said that like a redesign or a CMS change, that's when you would kind of reevaluate and maybe decide that, hey, AMP is just too costly to keep up. Do you envision this being a very common scenario for publishers?
Yeah, I mean, if you're going to do like a CMS migration, which everybody is going to do like once every 4 or 5 years, then you're going to have to take a really close look at AMP, because it's just so much. You're going to spend so much time doing 2 separate sites, because whenever an update is made, you of course have to update the AMP environment as well. And it does put a lot on your engineering team. So when they're going to make that type of change, I could easily see that we're just going to sunset AMP, But then, I mean, with that said, I think that the sites with the better technology are going to be a step ahead. That when you have publishing sites that have really invested in technology, that have created fast sites themselves, that have created sites that are easily indexable from Google and do keep track of that rather a lot, then those are the ones that are going to come to the forefront, where they're going to just do better in this environment. Whereas the other people that don't really have the technical bandwidth, that really can't make the change, are going to duct tape their AMP and really kind of just write it out for as long as they can, because they do have a fast environment with AMP that they've already been forced to do. And I see them staying on it much, much longer.
Did you say duct tape it out? Is that the
Yeah, we kind of call that we call that at BuzzFeed, because we have a CMS that's lasted a little bit longer than sometimes we would have hoped. So we just put some duct tape on it and make some correction instead of revamping the whole thing.
I mean, there's only so many people, so many helping hands, right? I just like that terminology used, duct taping it out. So what I've noticed in this discussion, and also within the community, like last week's live with Search Engine Land about the page experience update, and now talking to you and just John over at Condé Nast, and also Matthew Brown, there seems to be this discrepancy between agency SEOs and publishers. So John spoke of John Shihada, not Muller.
Mm-hmm.
A few days ago, he and I talking. He emphasized that it's important to optimize for core web vitals, UX factors, and test. And that just seems to be a running theme when you've worked as a publisher is, hey, we need to test this. We need to kind of see where everyone else is at. But the go-to advice from agency SEOs that I've heard is that they're going to stick with it until content continues, as long as content continues to perform well, but otherwise they're advising their clients to move away from it. That just kind of seems to be the difference there. One group is leaning towards testing and figuring it out as we go, and the other is like, well, let's just keep it in place until it's broken or just doesn't perform well, and then let's rip off that Band-Aid. There's not as much of an emphasis on testing. Why do you think that might be?
I think it's the motives that agencies have versus in-house SEOs. In-house SEOs, especially John, because John's in charge of so much at Condé Nast. You want to have a lot of business ramifications and business reasons for once people do get to your site, that they go and hit the type content that you'd like them to get to, that they have the best type of experience, that they create returning users that will also come to your site and go to the content that you'd like, whether it be 3 pieces of content or 5 pieces of content, and how to go and make sure to that content isn't completely archived, that you could refresh content in a certain way that will engage users. Now, agencies tend to want to have more of just get people in the door. And agencies, all the agencies I've talked to, tend to want to make sure that they could have development resources to go and get the improvements that they need. And I think that for them, coming in and getting those development resources is really helpful. So I think that they're not really looking at more of the long-term strategy, which is what we're doing at BuzzFeed. BuzzFeed's actually had a really good history of always testing. And they've made a name for, like, you just look at any BuzzFeed interview of anybody on staff, and they're going to talk about testing at least 5 or 6 times. And it's mainly because we've gotten to where we are today by just making sure that our user has the best experience that they can, and testing and prioritizing the amount of benefit to get the user the type of content that they're looking for, to really go and find that intent of what they're looking for when they're getting to BuzzFeed and getting what they want. So I think that John is doing the same with Condé Nast. When people do go there, of course, he's really looking at UX prioritization a little bit more than somebody that is coming in from an agency point of view that's just really caring about getting people in the door.
That's a good point. For any agency SEOs, I'm sure some are listening, maybe put that into your thinking process as well to get that full picture. I don't know if this is super appropriate to ask, and you can decline to answer, but just gut feeling for you, are you gonna vote? I'm sure there's many people that are gonna be involved in the decision. Are you gonna vote for keeping it or removing it if things stay the same for you right now?
Honestly, it's really gonna if things stay the same. Wow, that's a little bit tougher. I think, I can't really say until I see the amount of top stories that are coming in that don't have AMP. It's funny because after the announcement that they've made, it just seems like a lot of people have been talking about just getting off of AMP, that it's just not worth that extra bandwidth from your engineering team. And gosh, that is such a very, very tempting thing. So I'm leaning towards the idea of using our engineering crew to do some benefits that we have, because we have a lot of really, really great things in the pipeline that, we just don't have that much time for. So it's really going to be a cost benefit analysis of it at the time. And I know it's really difficult to say that right now, because if I had to choose right now, it would be just a really long conversation about like what we have versus what we have time for.
I love that. I was hoping that you would kind of skirt the answer a little bit, because that's what I want to show people, is that you can't just listen to the social media buzz or live within just the vacuum.
Oh, the buzz.
Yeah. You can't just live within the vacuum of what your job duties are, when the site traffic and the user experience will eventually bleed through to everyone else's positions within that company, or at least within marketing, right? You have to take an overall perspective and test and figure out what the climate is.
Yeah,
That's just my opinion, though.
No, I completely agree. It's really difficult to do it in a bubble, because honestly, things have changed so much on Google and on just website development. Our on BuzzFeed.com, it's really interesting. We just have a heavier JavaScript build on our desktop and on our mobile, so that does come into question with AMP as well. But I think that no matter what, you hear something like this from Google, and you're going to have to move in a direction of getting your site in a faster manner, because we have looked at the amount of people that come in from AMP, and yeah, we do like the fact that it does give them a faster experience.
Faster. We're talking faster. Thank you so much for that segue. It's perfect. Also, I want to remind our viewers, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. I'll try to get to them at the end. So these metrics, the core web vitals, they're not like just straight site speed. They are various aspects of the user experience. Largest contentful paint. I always have a difficult time saying that. First input delay, cumulative layout shift seems to be a big hit, because people are like, gosh, this is so frustrating when things jump around, right?
Yeah, and that was the only new one, right? All the other ones we knew that they were tracking, and even the cumulative layout shift, we also knew that they were tracking, and that is like really frustrating. But at the same time, that also comes in with just a heavy JavaScript build where everything gets like loaded later. I think that is a thing that in their example they showed more as an e-commerce type of issue. But yeah, no, but I think that's also the movement where Google has consistently said that they want to have less of a, you have to look at your site and how long it takes for a full load of it, and really prioritize that. And they've been trying to push that for quite a while now. So if you're willing to go along with that, and I think most publishers are, because it does provide a really good both SEO factor as well as a good user benefit, then I think that kind of shows us that we have to get our sites up to speed a little bit, so to speak.
There is also, though, that in Search Console you get these warnings like, oh, your CLS, your cumulative layout shift is greater than this threshold.
Yeah.
And it'll tell you that, and with every Search Console warning, there's always that little bit of anxiety. Anyway, I'm just talking about that in general. But how seriously is your team viewing these metrics in terms of like, do we have to hit these goals, or is it just part of the bigger picture and not such a big deal, working on it anyway?
I think the tough thing is that when I first got there, the different teams looked at the goals. So for example, the content team would care about, of course, our SEO discoverability, but at the same time, they don't really look at the GSC like drop-offs that happen, what happens is your engineering team will tend to look at that. And the engineering team, who sometimes does not really like to fit within Google parameters, will just look at it like, oh, wow, that's annoying. And then just look at some kind of tickets in the backlog. And sometimes that gets communicated to the product owner, and sometimes it really doesn't. So a lot of it comes with communication. When things like this happen, we do care about it because we do think that it has a huge impact on us. But at the same time, Google puts a high level of priority on how fast your site should be. So, it's not as easy as sometimes they would like to make it. Of course, we'd like everything to be in the green and not in the red. But we have to weigh that with what things of which we've already talked about, like ad revenue and certain other features on the site. So it's a big decision, but at the same time, I think a lot of our struggle has been that those drops and those fluctuations get communicated. So yeah, what we try to do is make sure that everybody that is a part of SEO discovery, whether it be the content team or the engineering, both understand the ramifications of that.
Right. So we're moving our discussion right along into sort of the future of AMP, because with this news, if the vast majority of agency SEOs are saying, hey, we don't need to do this anymore, we can free up the resources, we can optimize your site in other ways. We don't really know what it's going to be like to get into the top stories carousel, but AMP's future is in question. Is it just going to be another semi-successful product, or a product that people were forced to adopt to get this benefit? Are there any scenarios that you see in which continuing to use AMP after the change will be advantageous?
I think it's more that it's not about like continuing to use AMP being advantageous in terms of getting access to certain areas, because that's why everybody created it at the very start. I think it's more that if you just have it's more going to be sunsetted for places that feel like that they don't need it. So I think what's going to happen is eventually people are just going to test by putting the canonical on their mobile site. And then after that, if they see that there is not a drop in the amount of traffic that they're getting from top articles, then they're just going to make the shift and just let it go. I think that the tough thing is really going to be if you are looking at the fact that you have an AMP site that does do very well with all the metrics that are shown, that it's going to be difficult to not just ride that out for a while. So it all really does depend on the amount of bandwidth. And, we talked about this before, if you're going through like a major change, like a CMS migration, then you're going to really kind of weigh the amount of impact that that's going to have with the amount of time you're going to have to put into moving over AMP with it. So I think that those two factors are the biggest ones.
Right. So if publishers, where we kind of come to this fork again and again in our conversation, where we just don't know what the competition will look like to be in the top stories, and we don't know what the requirements will be in terms of these metrics that we can optimize for, or just how our competitors are getting in there. But let's assume that it's a pretty good mix, or that you can get into it without using AMP, the top stories carousel, right? What do you envision AMP will be used for, other than just for sites that are already on it and just duct taping it, as you so put earlier? What do you think the people who are continuing to use AMP, what do you think their sites are going to be like? How are they going to be using it?
There's a lot of benefit to AMP if you're getting a lot more engagement from your users when they're coming to the site via AMP, and it's just providing a better benefit for the user. Then I would think that you would want to keep it. It all depends on the priorities of your site and really how you make revenue. So if you're looking at changing from AMP, but at the same time, when people go to an AMP environment, it's a much better environment, then it's going to be hard to go off of it. Also, there's other things that we haven't really talked about. like PWAs, say you're setting up that you decided that you're going to do a PWA, and you're really looking at AMP as being like the first very quick hit for when people go to the site. I don't even know, like, there hasn't been that much talk about how much going, like, publishers that sunset off of that, how if they do have PWAs, how that's going to really affect them. But that's also a consideration if you've just like really doubled down on speed. There's also a good amount of publishers that I know that have AMP canonicals that are just like, and funny enough, that's how we did Tasty at the very beginning. We made an entire AMP site because we wanted to make the site as fast as possible. So I think that it all has to do with how your site is made up right now and the prioritization of how much speed affects the usership of your site.
And that is also another great point for me to insert this question. I do have my own line of questions, but you're giving me a break right here. One of our live participants has asked, what are your thoughts on having AMP being a self-referencing canonical and being able to serve AMP as the mobile and desktop version? We recently helped a client strip down their website to a more basic, cleaner version of the site, wondering how this 2021 shift will impact them.
So I'm super curious about what type of client it is and how they what their business goals are, because that really has a lot to do with it. There's a site that I know of when I worked more in the sports atmosphere. There was a sports betting site that did very, very well with doing AMP canonical. Their traffic went up rather significantly, and Google Webmaster's blog went and actually did a shout out to them because they were one of the first to go and do it. So if you're really looking to speed like create a site that's really fast, if you don't need things like interstitials, which a lot of people use to create a higher amount of list for your newsletter, I think it really has to do with your business goals. So I'm not against AMP canonical. I've seen that the traffic gone up rather significantly and the usership gone up because of how quick it is, and because AMP does take away a lot of things that people are really annoyed about, and give not the worst experience. Is really pretty good. So it really does depend upon business goals. I would like to give a more like concrete answer of like, whoa, no, we should totally do this. But I really do believe that you have to look at your business goals and decide if AMP really does cover that. I mean, it did for us at Tasty for a long time.
Wow, there's always seems to be a sports betting website that has like it's always sports betting websites. Some really
They're
great
coming up a
SEO
lot,
thing, right? Super important for them. Okay, let's think about the future even more. About like, let's say that this happens, this shift happens, and people are able to get into top stories without AMP. And as time goes by, if the past is any indicator, websites will only continue to get faster. So it's not really, I don't really envision like AMP getting double fast, right? The human mind doesn't care if a website loads in a quarter of a second or 0.15 seconds. To that end, what will happen if AMP goes away? I know like clearly you don't have the answer, but you must have some sort of like guess here. Or is it just going to quietly...
I personally think if AMP goes away, it's going to be another... I keep on bringing up like my engineering group, but it was very difficult for me to get AMP started because it's hard to go up to a development group and say, hey, look, Google has this new thing. Every now and again, Google has a long list of things that just fail. Like, remember when everybody was putting in Google authorship and those like author pictures showed up everywhere? And then we had to go take all that out. And like the amount of things that fail is just like ridiculous. So the work that we put in for AMP, and it really did look like that they were going to do AMP on so many things, from AMP stories to like just a variety. Like it looked like that they were really pushing AMP so much. To go and say that they're sunsetting this, I think just makes it more difficult for SEO people to go in and say, hey, we need to carve out a certain part of your backlog just to work on a Google experiment or what might be a Google experiment. And I think that that's the toughest thing. So if AMP does go away, it's going to be more difficult when in the future Google decides to do some kind of experiment also, and to really get buy-in from everybody. And of course, they'll just use traffic as a way of getting people to all do it, and we have to do it then. But at the same time, there's going to be some pushback from some development teams on how quickly that's going to be.
Right. We also have a question about just do you think Google opening top stories will allow more sites to show up in that feed? That is exactly what the news is, removing that AMP restriction. If you missed the beginning of the discussion, then yes, the page experience factors will be part of what dictates what shows up in that top stories carousel. Okay. What would need to happen or stay the same, though, for AMP to maintain its prominence, for AMP to still be kind of what it is? And unfortunately, it seems like most people, it's just not for the users. They don't seem to care so much, but for everybody else on this side of the industry and marketing, it just seems to be this thorn in your side where it takes up bandwidth, and you have to make all these concessions with advertising and so on and so forth. What would have to happen for AMP to maintain its prominence?
I think that you'd have to have some kind of benefit from a traffic perspective, that you'd have to just, let's say, have a new website that's coming out that's going to be a big political player, or a migration to a different site, or just any kind of CMS migration. I think that for them to decide to do AMP, whereas they haven't, or to make that decision of to make an AMP site as well, I think that you'd have to show some kind of traffic benefit. Because if there isn't any traffic benefit, I don't see anybody doing it. Because the problem is that Google provides so many restrictions on AMP, and the amount of time it takes is just going to be just such a deterrent from it, that without that traffic boost, then I don't see companies doing it.
Okay, so obviously the top stories carousel is like this huge, this huge issue because it drives so much visibility, right? Yeah. And we've talked about it in all these scenarios with AMP, without AMP. But I was wondering, what are your considerations? What do you try to take into account aside from just AMP right now, when you're trying to get content into that top stories carousel?
Well, a lot of it for us to try to get stories in the top stories carousel is mainly that we're looking at providing a fresher perspective. When people go to BuzzFeed, or when they see BuzzFeed, they expect a certain type of content, and we want to provide that type of content to our users because we think that they really appreciate it. So for us, what we're doing is we are, like I said, more reactive. So BuzzFeed will take a story that is, most of the times it goes into the entertainment portion of Google News, and we provide our more our kind of like our stance on it, which is more of a first-person type of perspective. And for BuzzFeed News, though, we try to provide a more comprehensive list, like an idea of that if you wanted to learn about the story itself, or wanted a full and complete overview of the story, and as well as some great investigative reporting, where we're going to dive a little bit deeper into stuff that you might ask yourself about the story and answer some questions that you might have. That's what we do for that. I think it's a little bit of a, well, of course we want to get in there because we want to get more traffic, but at the same time, what we're trying to do is really establish our brand, so that when you see BuzzFeed News and when you see BuzzFeed in those areas, that you'll click on it regardless of if you're first or second, mainly because you know us, you know our brand, and you know what you're going to get when you get there.
That's an interesting take on it. Yeah. I hope people do the same for search engine land. Fingers crossed. Okay, so I do have one last question, but if any of our live attendees want to ask a question, this will be your final chance. And before I get to it, I do want to remind everyone that next week, Tuesday and Wednesday, June 23rd and 24th, SMX Next is Search Engine Land's virtual conference. We've got speakers from Condé Nast, T-Mobile, Procter & Gamble, and many, many more covering the topics that affect your brand success or your client's success. There will also be keynotes from Search Engine Land's editorial staff, including myself. I'll be talking about content marketing. There's also going to be Ginny Marvin, Barry Schwartz, and Greg Sterling. It'll be a great time. And of course, it's free. You can check out the full agenda by just Googling, SMX next or binging it or DuckDuckGoing it, what have you. Yeah. Okay, cool. This is the question before we kind of just wrap things up here. If we get to a point where we're actually deciding to move off of AMP as publishers, and let's say that it's not caused by something like, oh, we're going to change CMSs, so let's just do this now anyway. With the state of how your traffic is and all the things considered, do you imagine it to be like a ripping off that duct tape, ripping off that bandage very quickly and moving everything off? Or is it going to be a slow kind of phase out? How do you envision that playing out?
I think that the tough thing is that it's going to be difficult to change your canonical for individual breaking news stories. So you're not going to be able to just say, for the next big story that comes out, we're just going to do, we're just going to take off the AMP and the AMP tag, and we're just going to go bring it to our mobile site. So I think that what's going to happen is that you're going to have a kind of a slowly ripping off the Band-Aid where you're going to try it for like a day or two and hope that, I don't know, there isn't a gigantic story like something monumental, that there's not like a coronavirus vaccine that comes out that day. So I think that that's more of what we're going to see, that people are going to test it for like a day or two and then revert back. It would be nice to just test it for just a couple stories to, really go slowly, because I don't think anybody wants to just jump in that pool unless that your site is just really great. So I think more you're going to see people just slowly tearing off the Band-Aid as opposed to ripping it, to answer your question.
Awesome. That's a surprisingly defined answer for this discussion. Right?
I'm trying.
Yeah, we're trying. Okay, before this wraps up, I was wondering if you had any other considerations for either in-house SEOs deciding how they're going to approach this situation, or for agency SEOs trying to figure out what they want to tell their clients. Were there any other considerations or angles that we missed in our discussion?
No, I think it's more that it's just well, first, I think that testing is going to be, of course, your friend in all of this, but every SEO has testing as their friend. I really think that the biggest consideration is going to be the amount of, we know this right now at this current point that an opportunity lies. And what can we do with our website right now to make it better when that change occurs? So we know that it's going to occur not immediately, whereas sometimes with Google, they'll just shut something off. We know that we have time for it. So right now, I think is the time for, if you're an in-house SEO, to have that conversation with your engineers, to have that conversation about what can we set up so that if we decide to go off AMP, we're in a good position, and what can we set up so that we'll know how much time we are spending on keeping this up and the cost benefit of it. So I think that if you're an in-house person right now, you should be having those conversations.
Well, excellent. Thank you. You've provided so many different things to consider. If you've watched this video live, it will be available on demand on searchengineland.com. We're going to upload that probably tomorrow. Yes, that's pretty much it. Matt Dorville, SEO manager at BuzzFeed. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to go ahead and say goodbye to everybody who attended live, and thank you for your time. Matt, if you could just hang on for a second, I just wanted to thank you a little bit more.
Sounds good. Thanks, sir.
Yes, everybody else, take care, and thanks again.